She was 23 and broke. No savings, just her grandmother's brass salt rake in her jacket pocket and $1 she had earned bagging shrimp at a wharf in Beaufort. With that $1, she bought an abandoned saltmaker's cabin on a saltmarsh point in Carteret County, North Carolina, on a stretch of down east coast that had not seen a sea salt crystal lifted off a cedar evaporation pan since 2010. The cedar shingles had silvered to bone. The cabin door had warped on its hinges. But what nobody knew was that hidden inside the brine cistern was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Annis Pigott had grown up in a building that smelled of salt smoke and pine wood. Other children grew up where the smell was cooking or family dog or yard-cut grass. Annis had grown up beside a small wooden salt cabin on a quarter-acre point of saltmarsh on Core Sound, where the air was always heavy with the briny smell of evaporating seawater and the resinous bite of pine smoke from the salt boiler firebox, where her grandmother's iron salt rake made a slow, steady scraping sound across the cedar pans in the afternoons and the long brine cistern at the back of the cabin held 300 gallons of slowly concentrating seawater at all hours of the working season. The cabin made salt. Not the industrial mined kind, not the kiln-dried kind. The kind that had been made on the down East Carolina coast since the 1840s, when a generation of Cornish and Scots English and Outer Banker salt makers had figured out how to take a flood tide draw of clean Atlantic seawater, a hand-stoked pine wood fire, 3 cedar evaporation pans, and a long iron salt rake, and turn them into fleur-de-sel flakes light enough that a wedding chef in Charleston would buy them by the ounce. Annis had been in the cabin on Saturdays since she could walk. Her grandmother's name was Hesse Pigott, born Hesse Salter, and she had been a sea salt maker at her own one-woman cabin on the Core Sound Point for 42 years. Hesse had inherited the trade from her father, an English immigrant named WHITLEY Salter, who had come from the salt-making village of Hale in Cornwall in 1908, with a hand-bound copy of his grandfather's salt evaporation notebook and a single canvas duffel of tools. Whitley had taken the long railway down out of Norfolk to Morehead City looking for clean tidal water and shelter from offshore weather, and by the spring of 1909 he had bought a quarter-acre of Saltmarsh Point on the down east shore for $40 and built the small cedar-shingled cabin with his own hands, the salt boiler in the brick firebox at the south end. The 3 cedar evaporation pans set on the long oak rake bench under the south windows, the tall cedar brine cistern at the back wall for concentrating seawater before the boil. The first batch of fleur-de-sel he raked off those pans was 1.5 pounds of pure white flake that a Beaufort tavern keeper bought for $2 in October of 1909. And the cabin had made salt without missing a season from then until October of 2010. Annis's mother was Cordelia Pigott, who had been 31 when Annis was born, and who had grown up at the salt cabin but had decided at 16 that she wanted nothing to do with a trade that left her hair smelling of pine smoke. Cordelia had moved into Beaufort, married a commercial waterman named Foy Pigott, who ran a small trawler out of Taylor's Creek, and Annis had grown up in a small frame house on the backside of Beaufort. From 4 on, every Saturday and every summer, Cordelia had driven Annis out to the Core Sound Point to spend the day with her grandmother. Hesse had raised her almost as much as Cordelia had. This past autumn Foy had been lost in a sounder squall on Pamlico Sound. His trawler had taken on water in 30-knot wind and a fast-shifting tide, and he had gone down with the boat off Portsmouth Island. He had been 38. The Coast Guard had not recovered the body. The trawler had not been insured for total loss. The small frame house in Beaufort had been mortgaged against a refit in 2022, and there was no way Cordelia could carry the payments. By April, she had sold the house at auction and moved in with her widowed sister in Newbern. The sister's house had 2 bedrooms. There was no room for Annis. On a Tuesday morning in May, Cordelia had told Annis, over coffee at the kitchen table on the last day before the closing, that she would have to find her own place. Annis had finished her coffee, washed her cup, gone upstairs, and packed everything she owned into 2 duffel bags inside of an hour. She had been 23. What Annis had instead, for all those 19 years, was her grandmother. Hessie Piggott lived alone in a small frame house behind the salt cabin on the Core Sound Point, where she had lived since her husband Avery had died of a stroke in the cabin's salt boiler heat in the summer of 1989. Hessie had been 46. She had never remarried. She had only ever had one child, Cordelia, and Cordelia was a daughter she loved but did not understand. After that there was only Annis. Hessie did not say this in words. But Annis knew it the way children know things. By the small canvas salt apron her grandmother kept on a peg for her, the size of a child's, sewn with 3 pockets for tasting samples. By the small brass salt rake Hessie had cut down to her hand for her 6th birthday so she could rake her own pans. The salt cabin was a single-room cedar-shingled building set on cypress pilings driven into the marsh, 18 feet wide and 32 feet long. The south wall held the brick firebox with the cast-iron salt boiler set into it and a cedar wood rick at its side. Under the south windows ran the long oak rake bench with the 3 cedar evaporation pans, each 4 feet square and 4 inches deep, set in their iron cradles. Along the east wall were the wooden grading bins for crystal grades, fleur-de-sel, gros sel, fine table, and the cedar storage rack of 1-pound and 5-pound salt papers. Against the north wall, at the back, stood the Brine Cistern, a tall cedar cabinet 6 feet high and 4 feet wide with a stave construction like a wine cask, held by 3 iron hoops, where flood-tide seawater drawn from the cove was held for 3 days to settle before going to the pans. The cistern had a false bottom screen of cedar slats 6 inches above the true floor to let sediment settle below the working brine. Whitley had built the cistern himself in 1909. The false bottom lifted out for cleaning. By 6, Annis could grade salt by feel. Hessie had taught her the cuts of the trade, the difference between fleur-de-sel, the top fragile crystal layer that formed on a calm pan in the first hours of evaporation, gros sel, the coarse crystals that fell to the bottom as the brine concentrated through the night, and fine table, the bottom slurry milled down for general kitchen use. The difference between first pan salt, can off the warmest pan, sweetest taste, and third pan salt, can off the coolest pan, sharper. The difference between a flake of pure nickel and a flake that still carried magnesium from incomplete settling, the second would dissolve faster on the tongue but go bitter in a closed jar within 3 months. By 8, Hessie let her stand at the rake bench with a small wooden scoop and lift the fleur-de-sel off the top of a pan into the grading bin, the small girl working the scoop with the slow, even motion her grandmother had taught her, never breaking the crystal skin until it was lifted clear. "Patience, baby girl," Hessie would say. "Patience. The salt does not come to your hand. Your hand goes to the salt. 1 crystal at a time. The sea is patient. So are you." By 10, Annis was tending a pan on her own through a full afternoon shift, stoking the firebox to the right cedar coals, watching the brine level fall, lifting the fleur-de-sel at the right moment, never letting the bottom char. The first full pound of fleur-de-sel she lifted clean on her own, with no hand from Hessie, was an October pan at the end of a clear day in 2010, and Hessie had weighed the sealed paper on the brass scale and folded it into the storage rack and turned to the next pan without a word. She had not needed to say anything. Annis had glowed for 3 days. Hessie taught her the failures too. There was a thing she called the gray pan. It was an evaporation pan that had been pushed too hard, the firebox stoked too hot, the brine evaporated too fast, so that magnesium and calcium impurities that should have settled out came up with the salt and left a gray cast through every crystal. Such a pan would yield the same weight as a clean pan. But within 6 weeks the gray salt would clump in its paper, and any chef who tasted it would set the rest of the order aside. "If you push a pan to gray," Hessie said, holding up a small folded paper of dull gray crystals from the box she kept on the bench for exactly this kind of teaching, "the salt will look like salt for a week. By the second month, the buyer will say this clumps and you will have to take the whole shipment back, dissolve it, resettle the brine in the cistern for a week, and re-evaporate. You cannot recover the time. You cannot recover the wood. You cannot recover the buyer. Do you understand what we are losing? Annis had nodded. She was 12 that summer. From that afternoon forward, she stoked the firebox by hand, and never let a pan heat past 150 degrees, and she never sent a gray paper out the door. Hessie taught her to read brine with her fingers. Salt water was not one thing, Hessie said. It was a moving stack of dissolved solids, sodium first, but also magnesium and calcium and a trace of bromine. Every flood tide slightly different in concentration depending on rain and wind and what the offshore current had brought in. A keeper who could feel the brine through her fingers could tell, by the way it slid against the skin, whether it was ready to go to the pans or needed another day in the cistern. Put your bare hand in the brine, baby girl, not your gloved hand. Bare, the brine will tell you. If it slides clean, it is ready. If it catches the heel of your thumb, even small, it has another day in it. By 13, Annis could lay her palm against the inside of the brine cistern at any hour and tell within 10 seconds whether the brine was at the right concentration. Hessie tested her sometimes by drawing a quart of brine into a glass and asking her to call it blind. She had never gotten it wrong. By 14, Annis was running the saltworks on Saturdays through the summer alone, while Hessie sat in the doorway with her bad back. By 15, she could grade a paper of salt at a glance and tell, by the way the crystals caught the light, whether it was fleur de sel grade or whether it had picked up second pan salt by mistake. By 16, she could reline the salt boiler firebox with fresh clay and grog mortar, a skill that took most apprentices 3 years to learn cleanly. By 17, she was packing salt papers with the brass corner crimp her grandmother had taught her, 1,200 papers a season for the chefs and tavern keepers who bought from the cabin. The trade had become her body. It had not occurred to her that it was a trade. To her it was simply what one did, on Saturdays and summer afternoons, in a salt-smelling cabin with one's grandmother. Hessie taught her the seasons of the trade. In April, when the spring tides ran clean and the water warmed, you drew your first flood tide brine and started a season. From May through September, when the sun and warm air did half the evaporation work for you, you ran 3 pans daily and could move 10 pounds of fleur de sel a week. In October, the cooler air shifted the chemistry. Fleur de sel formed slower. Gross sel formed faster. The season turned. By the end of October, you drained the cistern, banked the firebox, capped the pans with cedar lids, and closed the cabin until April. Then in April, you started again. There were stories from the trade Hessie would tell while her hands worked at the rake bench. The story about Mr. Eldon Davis, who had run a Down East seafood house on Harker's Island for 36 years and bought a 5-pound paper of Groscell from Hessie every other week all summer for his oyster curing room. Paid in cash on delivery, never a check. He had wept in the cabin doorway the September of 2009 when Hessie told him she was raising her price from $12 to $15. Not over the $3, but over the slow disappearance of a Down East food culture he had known his whole life. The story of the spring of 1996, when a young Beaufort restaurateur named Vance Brogden had ordered 300 pounds of fleur de sel for a new restaurant he was opening on the waterfront, and the week before delivery his wife had run off with his sous chef and the restaurant lease had collapsed. Vance had called Hessie from a payphone outside the bank with the broken news, and Hessie had told him to come and get the salt anyway and pay her when he could. Vance had used that salt to start a small catering operation from his mother's kitchen, paid Hessie back in installments over 4 years, and built that catering business into a 50-seat restaurant by 2002 that was still cooking on Hessie's salt the year she died. The story of a winter in 1993 when a young Mexican woman from Veracruz had walked the Cove Road with a 4-year-old son on her hip, asking work, and Hessie had given her a winter's wage and taught her to read the brine in 11 weeks. The woman had gone on to start her own sea salt operation back home in Veracruz and had named her first daughter Hessie. There was the morning Annis would always remember from the summer she was 16. The July of 2018 had brought a long line of afternoon thunderstorms up the down east coast, and on the third morning of that week, a small wooden skiff had come into the picket dock with 2 children in it and no adult. The children were a 7-year-old boy and his 5-year-old sister, and they had been camping with their father on a remote spoil island 4 miles east when their father had collapsed of a heart attack at first light. The boy had untied the skiff, started the small outboard, and motored straight at the only smoke he could see across the sound, Hesse's salt boiler chimney. Hesse had taken the children in, called the Coast Guard from the cabin telephone, fed them salt-cured ham biscuits, and sat at the table with them for 2 hours while a rescue boat went to recover their father. The father had survived. He had come to the cabin the following Sunday with a sealed envelope of $2,000 to thank her. Hesse had taken the envelope, taken out $150 for the chimney smoke, and pressed the rest back into his hand. "Use it on those children, son," Hesse had said, "and teach the boy to look for smoke." Annis had been at the rake bench that whole morning. She was 16, and she had understood without anyone telling her that the trade was not the $50, and never had been. Hesse told her stories that were really lessons. Once, when Annis was 11 and had asked why her grandmother bothered making sea salt by hand when a 5-pound bag of mined diamond crystal could be bought at the Piggly Wiggly for $2.99, Hesse had set down the rake she was working with, turned to her, and said, "Mindy salt is a chemical. Sea salt is a memory. When you taste a flake of fleur-de-sel from this pan, you are tasting the storm that came up off Cape Lookout last week, and the river of fresh water that came down out of the Nyus 3 days ago, and the offshore current that carried it all here. A chef who cares about that taste cannot get it from a bag at the Piggly Wiggly. There are people in this country who still want to taste where they are. The salt is for them. That is also the trade. The salt is how we pay back the people who still want to taste the sea." Annis had understood this without being able to say it. The salt was a promise. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever tasted a flake of true hand-evaporated sea salt and felt the place it was made come alive on your tongue? Hesse died in October of 2010, in her own bed in the small frame house behind the salt cabin, of pneumonia she had quietly worked through the last weeks of the season. Annis was 11. Cordelia had been the executor. She sold the salt cabin to a developer who wanted to convert the point into a vacation rental, but the developer pulled out in 2011 when the marsh setback failed Carteret County wetland inspection, and the cabin sat unsold for 15 years, with the deed reverting to the county for back taxes nobody had ever paid. Cordelia had kept the small frame house behind the cabin as a long-term rental until 2024, when she sold it to settle the Piggott House mortgage after Foy's death. Annis had been given nothing of her grandmother's except the small brass salt rake cut to a child's hand from her 6th birthday. Annis had walked the cove, rode past the cabin every summer of her childhood, and looked at the warped door and the weathered shingles, and made herself a promise, without yet having the words for it. When Cordelia told her, that Tuesday morning in May, to find her own place, Annis packed everything she owned into 2 duffel bags. The brass salt rake in its leather sheath, a coffee can with $1,670 from 3 summers bagging shrimp at the Beaufort Wharf. 3 changes of clothes, a photograph of Whitley Salter in the cabin doorway in 1909 with a salt rake over his shoulder. A man on Highway 70 outside sea level had a 1994 Chevy S10 for $1,650 cash. She handed him the money and drove east with $20 over. For 9 nights she slept in the cab behind St. Andrews where Father Adrian Whitaker had told her the lot was hers as long as she needed. On the 10th morning, she found the listing in the Carteret County News-Times under the column titled Properties of Interest. 1 cedar shingled commercial structure at the Core Sound Point in Atlantic, parcel 4916, Unclaimed for 15 years, asking price $1. Annis read the line twice and walked across the street to the Carteret County tax office. The clerk behind the counter was a 66-year-old woman in a faded cream cardigan, name tag Issis's. Wilma Piggott, distant cousin on her father's side. Annis said she had come about the salt cabin at the Core Sound Point. Mrs. Piggott's hand stopped halfway to her coffee cup. "Piggott," she said. "You're Hessie's grandgirl." Annis nodded. Mrs. Piggott drew a manila folder from a filing cabinet and laid it open. The cabin had reverted to the county in 2011 when the developer's sale collapsed. Nobody had inquired in 15 years. Asking price $1. Mrs. Piggott slid the deed across, slid a pen after it, and said, "Your grandmother sold my mama a 5-pound paper of fleur-de-sel every Christmas Eve for 28 years. We salted our Christmas ham in that salt from 1982 to 2009. Put your name here, baby." Annis signed. She drove the Chevy out the Cove Road in the May afternoon with the deed in a folder on the passenger seat and a brass key Mrs. Piggott had pulled from her own desk drawer. The cabin stood where she remembered it, single-story cedar shingle gone weathered bone. Set on cypress pilings driven into the marsh, the front door warped open at its hinges, the chimney leaning slightly south, the cove and the sound stretching out behind it gray-green under a low overcast sky. Annis turned the key. The warped door scraped inward. The rake bench was still there. The 3 cedar evaporation pans in their iron cradles, empty cedar lids stacked along the south wall. The cast-iron salt boiler in the brick firebox, the firebox door rust frozen shut. The wooden grating bins. The cedar storage rack of salt papers, empty but for a single 5-pound paper of Grove's sell from the last October that had crystallized into a brick. The smell at the door was pine smoke and old brine, and the cold mineral smell of cast iron. Annis stood in the middle of the floor and breathed it for a minute. She walked to the back wall, to the brine cistern. The tall cedar cabinet was 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, held by 3 iron hoops. She lifted the cedar lid off the top. The cistern was bone dry inside, the stave silvered with old salt crystal. The false bottom screen was still in place, a square of slatted cedar 6 inches below the top of the working depth. A memory came back. Hessie, the summer Annis was 8, kneeling at the open cistern hatch and reaching down into it. Your great-grandfather Whitley was a careful man, baby girl. When he built this cistern in 1909, he made the sump under the false bottom 6 inches deeper than it needed to be. He told me about it the week before he died in 1961. He said it was where the salt cabin kept what could not be lost. I never lifted the false bottom. Annis had forgotten the story for 15 years. She reached down through the open top of the cistern, lifted the false bottom screen out, and set it on the rake bench. The sump beneath was dry, the brine had drained in 2010 and never been refilled. In the back corner of the sump, wedged into a small cedar shelf Whitley had built into the wall, sat a tin box the size of a brick. The lid stamped Whitley, 1909. She lifted it out with both hands. She lifted the lid. An oilcloth bundle, heavy in her hands, opened to reveal 224 gold coins stacked in even rows, Liberty pieces and half-eagles. The savings of a Cornish immigrant who had not trusted any American bank with anything he could not see. The coin dealer in Newbern would later weigh the lot at $23,600. Beneath the bundle, a leather-bound notebook held Whitley's 1909 brine concentration chart, every saltwater density measurement to the 3rd decimal, every evaporation rate by pan size and temperature, in his Cornish-trained hand. Then, the leather-bound salt book, Hessie's own ledger, every pound of salt she had made from 1968 through 2010. And on top of the ledger, sealed with deep blue wax, a folded letter with Annis's name across the front. Annis broke the wax with her thumbnail. She sat down on the rake bench in the cold May light from the south windows and read the letter through. October 14th, 2010, Annis. By the time you find this, I will be gone, and the cabin will have stood quiet long enough that you will have come back to it. My father Whitley set this money under the false bottom in 1909 because he did not trust any American bank with his Cornish money. He told me about it the week before he died and made me promise not to lift the bottom. I have kept the promise. The salt fed us through every year of my life and most of yours. It will not feed us now. Your mother will sell what she can, but this box she cannot sell, because she does not know it is here. The chart is Whitley's. The ledger is the record. Make salt again if it suits you, baby. The cabin is yours. Essie Piggott, salt maker, 14 October 2010. Annis closed the letter into the inside pocket of her grandmother's old faded oxblood red wool sweater jacket. She did not cry. She walked over to the brine cistern and laid her palm flat on the inside of one of the cedar staves where the brine had stood for 42 years, felt the salt crystal pattern etched into the wood from 60 years of evaporation. The cedar was cool. The crystal pattern was perfect. Into the cold air over the marsh she said, quietly, "Thank you, mister. Salter, I will boil salt again." She drove the Chevy down to the Carteret Savings Bank on Front Street in Beaufort that Monday, with the tin box on the passenger seat. Mrs. Lorena Whitehurst, the branch manager, weighed the coins on the bank's brass scale, called the dealer, and confirmed $23,600. Annis deposited $23,000 and walked back to the truck with $600 folded into the inside pocket of the jacket. The first month was resealing the brine cistern and relining the salt boiler firebox. The cedar staves had dried and split in 3 places over 15 years. The cast iron boiler had taken hairline cracks at the throat. Annis ordered fresh cedar from a sawmill outside Williamston for $130. A retired Down East boat builder in Atlantic came down and showed her how to plane and fit replacement staves and reset the 3 iron hoops with a wedge. She relined the firebox with clay and grog mortar mixed in a tin tub. She scrubbed the evaporation pans clean with a stiff brush and seawater. The first time she stoked the firebox and watched the first 3 gallons of brine come to a simmer, she stepped out onto the cove side of the cabin in the cool June dusk. She lived through the rest of that first year on the Salter Gold and a few small commissions, a 5-pound paper of fleur-de-sel for a wedding chef in New Bern, a regrading job for an old customer of Hesse's whose 2009 paper had clumped. The cabin became hers a piece at a time across that first summer. A folding screen partitioned a small living corner between rake bench and brick firebox, a bed under the east window where she could see the sound, a 2-burner kerosene stove on a tin-top table. A yard sale outside sea level yielded a kitchen table for $14. The Episcopal Church basement gave up a wooden rocking chair with Father Whitaker's help. On a Sunday in August, Mrs. Piggott brought Hesse's old hand-knit shawl in a paper bag. She gave me this the winter my Lloyd passed in '88. It belongs here now. Annis laid it across the foot of the bed. A retired Down East waterman named Mr. Calhoun Styron, 84, drove out one Saturday after Father Whitaker mentioned Hesse's grandgirl was back. He pulled up in a dusty white Dodge Power Wagon he had owned since 1989 and said, "I cut and hauled firewood for your grandmother's salt boiler 38 years. Your pilings have a slow lean to the southeast. I'll shim them tomorrow. Bring me coffee." He came back the next morning, jacked the corners, drove cedar wedges in, and was gone before noon. She lay awake that first night in the partitioned corner. The slow lap of the sound against the cypress pilings under the floor whined through the bay tree above the cabin. A clapper rail called once from the salt grass and was answered farther off. The roof above her was the first roof she had owned since she was 11 years old. Things found their places. The oxblood jacket went on a peg above the rake bench. Whitley's empty tin box sat on the top shelf of the storage rack. The brass salt rake took its old position 3rd tool from the left on the rake bench. A new ledger went on the table, and Annis began entering her own salt, June 18, 2024. Newburn Wedding Fleur-de-Sel. 5-pound paper, $115. Mr. Calhoun Styron came every Saturday morning. He still drove the same power wagon. He came up the Cove Road with a thermos and a sack of his wife's hush puppies. He took a cup at the table, set the hush puppies on the rake bench, said Hessie would have liked this, and drove home. In her second year, a coastal heritage chef named Mr. Beaumont Calder drove down from Charleston in a white Mercedes Sprinter. He owned a farm-to-table restaurant on Bay Street that had searched 4 years for a Down East sea salt producer at restaurant grade. He walked the rake bench, tasted a sample paper Annis had set out, and named his terms 200 pounds a month April through October, $24 a pound. Delivered to Charleston by the 15th. Annis took his hand on it. The first Charleston check, when it cleared in late October, paid for her second winter at the cabin. The orders grew. Mrs. Verley Daniels, a neighbor who lived a half-mile up the Cove Road, brought a jar of fig preserve every August and ordered 1/4-pound paper of fleur-de-sel every Christmas Eve for her grown sons. At an estate sale in Smyrna, Father Whitaker found the original 1909 sign, Salter Sea Salt, Core Sound, and drove it 40 miles back without gas money. A Carolina food magazine ran a feature, and orders arrived from across the South, Asheville, Atlanta, Savannah, Birmingham, until she raised her per-pound price by $3 and was booked 5 months out. By the second autumn, she had a habit of sitting on the cypress dock above the cove in the last hour of daylight, with a coffee mug warm in both hands. Core Sound had gone steel gray with October. Spartina turned russet in the low sun. She thought of Hessie, of Whitley, whom she had never met, but whose hand had set the cistern under her palm, of the row of hands on the rake that had come down to her own. That's the thing about the trade our grandmothers teach us to keep. We do not always know, when we are 6 years old and standing at a rake bench with our hand on our grandmother's belt, that the standing is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, crystal by crystal. And then, 15 years after the old woman dies, we lift a false bottom she would not lift and find what she has left for us, and we understand what she has been teaching us. She had been teaching us that salt is the sea's memory the hand collects and keeps. She had been teaching us that the trade is not the salt. The trade is the patience. The trade is the hand that learned, the hand that teaches, and the hand that comes after. Annis Pigot was 23 years old and broke. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned saltmaker's cabin on a saltmarsh point in Carteret County on the down east coast of North Carolina. It was the best in dollars she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full quiet road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next quiet road.